revolutionary like I'm Huey Newton. Che Guevara when them bullets start shooting.
Hello comrades, and welcome to another episode of Communism for Beginners, where this time we discuss the foundations of Leninism. So, in case you haven't already read the introduction to the Foundations of Leninism, I will put a couple of links to the description where you can either read it or you can listen to the audio version of the introduction if you don't have the time to read it, or if you're lazy or whatever, if you prefer to not read it. In this one we're only going to be discussing the introduction segment, which is fairly short, so this shouldn't take too long. It's also fairly self-explanatory. The language is pretty easy to understand. I have a pretty lengthy quote, so I'm just gonna go through this. I'm gonna read you the quote, and then I'm gonna comment on the quote, like when there's something that might be a little bit unclear, I'm gonna comment. So it begins, what is Leninism? In case you don't know who Lenin was the leader of the Russian Communist Revolution of 1917, the October Revolution. He was the leader of the Bolshevik party. That was what they called themselves, the Bolsheviks. What exactly is Leninism then? Well, it's communism, but how is it different from Marxism? Well, that's what we are about to find out. What is Leninism? Some say that Leninism is the application of Marxism to the conditions that are peculiar to the situation in Russia. This definition contains a particle of truth, but not the whole truth by any means. Lenin indeed applied Marxism to Russian conditions, and applied it in a masterly way. But if Leninism were only the application of Marxism to the conditions that are peculiar to Russia, it would be purely national and only a purely Russian and only a Russian phenomena. Of course, we Marxist-Leninists, we consider that Leninism is universally applicable. Leninism can be applied anywhere, so we cannot accept that Leninism is supposedly only the application of Marxism to the Russian situation. That is not the case, so that's why that is not a sufficient definition. So let's keep going. We know, however, that Leninism is not merely a Russian but an international phenomenon rooted in the whole of international development. This is why I think this definition suffers from one-sidedness. Others say that Leninism is the revival of the revolutionary elements of Marxism of the 40s of the 19th century, as distinct from the Marxism of the subsequent years, when it is alleged it became moderate, non-revolutionary. So this part deals with the fact that I mentioned in one of the previous videos that Marxism wasn't the big socialist movement in Russia when Lenin came into the scene. Marxism wasn't really the biggest idea there was out there. There was all kinds of utopian socialism, like Marxism is scientific socialism, but there were all kinds of utopian movements like the Narodniks, for example. But there was, even in Marxism wasn't really the biggest trend in Marxism itself. In Marxism there was the various trends like Bernsteinism and movements like that. Bernstein was this guy, and I think they even called themselves the revisionists, because nowadays revisionism is kind of like a dirty word. It's kind of like an insult. If you think somebody's a bad Marxist, you call them a revisionist. Revisionism means altering some core principles of Marxism, distorting it, if you will. But the revisionists at the time, they said that they are like fixing Marxism, they're improving it, they're fixing some things that are broken with it. So here this definition is suggesting that maybe, because Lenin brought Marx back to Marx, he said, no, you're revisionist, you're wrong. Marxism is about this and it's not about that. So he restored the revolutionary content of Marxism in Russia and elsewhere. So maybe that's what Leninism is. So let's continue. If we disregard this foolish and vulgar division of the teachings of Marx into two parts, revolutionary and moderate, we must admit that even this totally inadequate and unsatisfactory definition contains a particle of truth. This particle of truth is that Lenin did indeed restore the revolutionary content of Marxism, which had been suppressed by the opportunists of the Second International. Still, that is but a particle of truth. The whole truth about Leninism is that Leninism not only restored Marxism, but also took a step forward. In case you don't know, the Second International was the first international was called the International Working Men's Association or something like that. So that was basically where all the communists and all the people like that, there were anarchists as well. So Marx, Engels, Bakunin, people like that. So they got together and they tried to form this international organization where they could coordinate their stuff like on an international level. The Second International was like the same thing, different people. It happened later. So after the first one was disbanded, at one point they, different people got together. They said, let's form the Second International. So they did. And the opportunism of the Second International that Stalin brings up, that's the Second International largely split on the issue of the First World War, because many of the people and many of the parties in the Second International, they became so-called social chauvinist. They said that in the first imperialist war, the First World War, they said that the workers of every country should support their own capitalist governments, which went completely against Marxism. It went completely against the Marxist principle of proletarian internationalism. Marx said workers of all countries unite. It didn't say workers of all countries kill each other for your capitalist countries. So that's why he calls it opportunism. Lenin and the Leninist position was revolutionary defeatism, which was that in this war, the First World War, where there genuinely nobody who was in the war was there for a good reason. They all just wanted to conquer and steal and plunder. So Lenin said, instead of doing that, instead of getting killed for something as dumb as that, why don't you just fight your own government and try to overthrow your capitalist governments? Try to stop your own imperialist governments from attacking other countries. But he goes on and continues that Leninism did not only restore Marxism, but it also took a step forward. So what is that step forward? Well, let's continue. Developing Marxism further under the new conditions of capitalism and the class struggle of the proletariat. What then, in the last analysis, is Leninism? Leninism is the Marxism of the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution. To be more exact, Leninism is the theory and tactics of the proletarian revolution in general, the theory and tactics of the dictatorship of the proletariat in particular. So that is a really good definition of Leninism, in my opinion. So Leninism is the Marxism of the era of imperialism. So in Marx's time, there was really no imperialism in the modern sense. There was like colonialism, sure, but there was no modern imperialism. Modern imperialism is when a country goes and says, we want to exploit your cheap labor, we want to exploit your natural resources, we want to take over your markets. And that kind of tendency happens when inside the country there's nowhere for the capitalism to go. The capitalism needs more markets, the capitalism needs more resources, the capitalism needs more cheap labor. But when the country itself, and it spreads inside the country, but when the country is kind of full, there's no more markets to have. They need to conquer new ones, and there's no more. They have accumulated so much capital that it doesn't make sense to invest inside the country anymore. The country is kind of full, so they say, well, we have to start shipping this capital. This capital, we have to invest it abroad. So therefore, we need to go, for example, to India and set up a factory over there, because we have all this capital, and of course, it's also cheaper in India. So we should also do it. But back then, that wasn't so much the case. Nowadays, it's even more preferable for the capitalists to do it, because nowadays we've got it much faster to send stuff. You can communicate with people on the other side of the globe. You can send stuff to the other side of the globe much easier. But back then, that wasn't yet the case. But in any case, they were living in a totally new economic era of imperialism, era of monopoly capitalism. It's not one factory owner versus his workers. It's entire monopolies, entire huge corporations of hundreds and hundreds of factories, and it's international instead of just in these are even multinational corporations. And also, so Leninism is the Marxism of the era of imperialism and the proletarian revolution. So the proletarian revolution, what does that mean? Well, there's actually a worldwide proletarian movement. So he continues, Marx and Engels pursued their activities in the pre-revolutionary period. We have the proletarian revolution in mind. When developed imperialism did not yet exist, in the period of the proletarians' preparation for revolution, in the period when the proletarian revolution was not yet an immediate practical inevitability. The proletariat was not really that developed in all countries. Proletariat was not really yet formed as a class. There was no imperialism. But Lenin, the disciple of Marx and Engels, pursued his activities in the period of developed imperialism, in the period of unfolding proletarian revolution. When the proletarian revolution had already triumphed in one country, had smashed the bourgeois democracy, and had ushered in the era of proletarian democracy, the era of the Soviets. This is why Leninism is the further development of Marxism. It is usual to point to the exceptionally militant and exceptionally revolutionary character of Leninism. This is quite correct, but this specific feature of Leninism is due to two causes. Firstly, to the fact that Leninism emerged from the proletarian revolution, the imprint of which it cannot but bear. Secondly, to the fact that it grew and became strong in clashes with the opportunism of the Second International, the fight against which was and remains an essential preliminary condition for a successful fight against capitalism. It must not be forgotten that between Marx and Engels on the one hand and Lenin on the other, there lies a whole period of undivided domination of the opportunism of the Second International, and the ruthless struggle against this opportunism could not but constitute one of the most important tasks of Leninism. The other things that he mentioned were that Leninism is the theory and tactics of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the theory and tactics of the proletariat revolution in general, and the theory and tactics of the dictatorship of the proletariat in particular. Lenin also developed a lot of this practical theory of the actual revolution, how to do the actual revolution. Marx and Engels didn't write that much about that. They wrote some things. They critiqued the Paris Commune for certain things that they thought the Paris Commune should have done better. They said various things, like they even wrote about various peasant uprisings and various things. But the main difference was that Lenin was deeply involved in the actual working class movement. At least his entire adult life, he was deeply involved in the actual working class movement. So therefore he wrote extensively on how to do various things. How to, do strikes, how to organize, what the party should look like, what the party should do in various circumstances, what classes they should ally with, what classes are reliable and what classes are not, and he developed how the party should what kind of organization the party should have inside it, how they should take part in if they should take part in parliaments at all, and in what circumstances they should take and what circumstances they shouldn't take part in parliaments, and all kinds of things like that. He wrote extensively on that subject. Marx and Engels didn't really do that because they, at the time, in their time, there wasn't really that kind of a movement. And then the dictatorship of the proletariat, that means the workers' state. So it says dictatorship, but it doesn't mean dictatorship in the how people usually understand dictatorship, because usually when people think about dictatorship, they think like Hitler or Mussolini or something, like it's one guy, or it's Pinochet or Batista, like this one guy and his clique. No, it doesn't mean that. It means dictatorship as in they have control. So it's it's the dictatorship of the proletariat. So the proletariat, the wage workers have control. So it's a dictatorship of the wage worker class. And you could add to that it's basically the state machine and society controlled by the wage worker class and all their allied classes, like the poor and the working peasants, for example, and their party, and all the other forces which support them, basically. So Lenin developed a lot of this theory of what the revolutionary state, the state where the workers have taken control, what that should look like, because Lenin was involved in the actual process of building that state, because Lenin was the leader of the party which actually managed to successfully take power. They had to figure out, okay, we've got power, now what? How are we gonna set up this state? How are we gonna deal with various things like set up the national economy and rebuild after all the damage that the war has done? And they had to actually win the civil war. They had to defend the country from invasions. They had to do all these things, and then how are we gonna move forward? And actually, we are in control of this semi-feudal, semi-capitalist, agrarian country. How are we gonna actually turn that into a modern, industrialized country? And how are we gonna actually turn that from a semi-feudal, semi-capitalist country to a socialist country? So that he had to think about all that stuff. Marx kind of just came up with the idea of let's have a dictatorship of the proletariat, but he wasn't involved in the actual building of that. That is another one of the things that separates Leninism from just good old school Marxism, which some people say, Lenin was wrong, let's go back to the old school Marxism, but really when they say that, they mean that let's go back like 200 years ago. That's not possible. You can't do that. You can't just ignore the fact that imperialism exists nowadays. But yeah, that was that. Next time we're gonna talk about Chapter 1, the historical roots of Leninism, and yeah, see you then.